Well, God, we are grateful for your presence with us today. We are always grateful for your presence, but we are people who are grateful and thankful for when your presence is tangible, for when we sense it, we feel it, we know it, whatever that may be. And so I'm grateful for that today. I'm never not grateful for that. I pray as we dive into your word now that we would be encouraged, we would be challenged, we'd be corrected, we'd be built up, whatever it is that your Spirit needs to work in us today, God. May it be so. We commit this time to you for your purpose and your glory, I pray. Amen. Well, good morning, church. Good morning, some of you who are visiting with us or haven't been here in a while. Nice to have you back. For those of you watching online, good morning to you. And for those of you at the soundboard, good morning. This is our last Sunday in the Spaces and Places series. We're going to wrap it up today and then move into the big celebration next week, and then the week following we will be into Advent, into our Christmas season already. So we've looked at different locations and places where we encounter God. We've talked about the valley of darkness or the shadow of death. We've talked about the place of rescue, and then last week we started really a two-part sermon within this series, just sort of confusing, but I do that sometimes. Looking at the story that comes out of Genesis 16, focusing primarily on three characters, on Sarai, Abram, and then Hagar. So last week we, of course, looked at the first two, Sarai and Abram, and they're sort of stumbling towards the promise. And then we now will pick up and complete this sermon and this series by looking at Hagar. Last week, the focus was very much on when we feel disregarded by God. Today, we're going to look more at when we feel disregarded or, in fact, have been disregarded by people. So I'm not sure if you've noticed this or not. I suspect you have. But in the last number of years, a common expression of caring, of comfort that we both offer to others, but also that I think we receive when we are in need is this. And again, you've likely heard it, but you are seen. Just know you're seen. I've seen this sentiment in pastel colors and whimsical fonts scattered across social media. I've heard it said to people struggling. I'm pretty sure I've said it. It's been said to me, and it's not wrong and it's not untrue. But the popularity of this expression does seem to indicate that we are a generation of people that needs to be seen. Now, the reasons for this are certainly many, and I don't claim to be an authority on this. I am not a psychologist. I am not a sociologist. But one explanation that I would at least present to you, and this again shouldn't be all that earth-shattering either. I think you've probably thought about this. But one explanation for this needs to be seen is that every single person living in 2021, by the way of social media, have their very own platform, very own spotlight, to declare and promote themselves to countless friends, allegedly, enemies, acquaintances, and strangers alike. This is a spotlight. This is a platform that no human would have had 5 or 30 years ago. And it has led our society to feel as though it has 24-hour access to the attention of other people. The attention of others who we believe, seemingly by what we post on social media, is these people care what we had for lunch. They care where we spent our Saturday. They care what we did every single day of our vacation. They care when it's our birthday. They care when it's our child's birthday. They care what our opinion is on the hottest topic, what our newest home renovation is, and the list goes on and on and on and on. I'm not saying any of that's wrong. That is part of our culture today. But I am saying, and I'm simply highlighting it to say we seem to be addicted to having our lives seen and noticed. Stuff that I think 30 years ago we wouldn't have expected anyone would necessarily care to know. I mean, we had to wait for the birthday card to arrive in the mail for someone to acknowledge our birthday, right? And because of this uninhibited access to instant platform, instant spotlight, instant microphone, we are addicted to being noticed as a society. Therefore, when an action of someone causes us to feel unseen, it's crippling in a way that I'm not sure it was 30 years ago. And unfortunately, this happens a lot because we live in an imperfect world with imperfect people, including ourselves. So the good news is this common experience of feeling unseen and disregarded by people is still one of the places where God is found and is encountered. So, right off the hop, I say if you're in a place, a space where you feel disregarded by people, you've been cast off, overlooked, whatever it may be, you're in a spot to find God. We're going to talk about why and how that works today. And I think for this generation that is seemingly desperate to know that it's seen and too often feel as though it's not, this is a really important truth to take hold of, this truth that God sees you, that you are seen not just by all the people on social media, but in fact by a God who loves you perfectly. So Genesis 16, that's where we're going this morning. Like I said, we're going to wrap up. We'll have gone through most of this chapter. I think I might omit the final verse, but otherwise we're going to go right through it. To refresh your memory, or at least give us a little bit of a segue from last week to this week, we'll pick up in verse 6 and then move right through verse 14. Abram speaking to Sarai. Your slave is in your hands. He's speaking of Hagar, Abram said. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar, spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from? And where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you're pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility towards all his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord, who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So there's your text. As we discussed last week, Sarai and Abram stumbled their way towards this promise of a child given in Genesis 15. And in doing so, stumbling towards this promise, they drag Hagar, Sarai's maidservant, into their mess. The pregnancy of Hagar through Abram, according to Sarai's wishes, causes great tension to develop between the two women. And Abraham tosses Hagar back to Sarai, says, do with her what you think is best, and she mistreats her. And she mistreats her to a point that Hagar runs away. She flees. So the word used for mistreated, as used in the NIV, to describe how Hagar was treated by Sarai is worth pausing on and just considering for a moment, because I think it gives color to the significance of what takes place here, God's grace. So mistreatment or mistreated it's a broad term, and it's used to describe a broad Hebrew word. And so I understand why the NIV uses it, but what is lost in the English word mistreatment is, I think, the harshness, maybe even the brutality of how Sarai treated Hagar. Hagar was treated worse than like generally unwell, which is, I think, maybe how mistreated sounds, at least to ears in 2021. So, for example, the same word translated as mistreated here is used in Exodus 1:11 to describe how the Egyptians treated the Israelite slaves. Okay? So it's a mistreatment that is only possible if one deliberately overlooks the suffering of another person. It's not just being rude from time to time, or using poor manners, or being unkind here and there. Hagar was treated poorly on purpose. Okay. And because she was then deliberately disregarded, deliberately overlooked as someone worthy of respect and care, she runs away. And so some commentators believe that because she was Egyptian, Hagar was running south. She's like flying south to find refuge. She was trying to return to her homeland. We don't know that for sure, but some speculate that seems to be where she's going based on where we find her in the story. And well on the run, somewhere between Canaan and her, might say, God shows up. After 6 verses of people feeling disregarded and God's voice being seemingly nowhere, we know he's present, but there's no words of God. In the whole sermon last week, we didn't look at any of God's words to these people because there aren't any in the first 6 verses. But now God finally appears. He appears to Hagar, and our first takeaway from this story is very plain, very simple, but it's deep and it's rich. It's simply this, that God listens to the disregarded. So verses 7 and 8, the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert, the spring beside the road to Shur, and he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. So last week in the sermon, we talked about that when we are standing in the midst of promise or the midst of purpose coming to pass in our lives, that even when it seems God isn't there, he is. That the midst is still a place where his purpose is going forward. We looked at the story of Abram and Sarai, and we said God didn't go anywhere. They were just in the thick of it. They just didn't believe that. So there's one aspect of God's care, which is that he seems far away, but he's not, and his purposes go on. But God's not stuck to one way or one type. We also find then in Hagar's story that in addition to being in the midst of purpose and God kind of being far away, but overseeing sovereignly what takes place, God also sometimes just shows up right in the thick of it. And that's what he does for Hagar. The midst is a place where God practically revealed himself to Hagar in a way that he didn't, at least in Genesis 16, reveal himself to Sarai and Abram. So God reveals himself to Hagar by asking her a question, a personal question. So verse 8, God begins. And notice he begins by addressing her status and her name. Slave of Sarai, he says. And as soon as God uses this address, God begins to reveal to this lady that he's a God who knows exactly who she is. We might even say he's a God who knows exactly what she is, because he's a personal God, aware of her personally. Slave of Sarai. He uses her name and he uses her story to address her. But then he asks her a question. Where have you come from? And where are you going? Though God knows her story, because he's God, he invites Hagar to consider it for herself. But then, I love this, tell him what has driven her to travel this desert all by herself. And when God offers this invitation via question, God is extending great generosity to this lady. And he's doing so because he's giving her what no one else had. God gives her his ear. God listened to her. He says, tell me what's going on. You see, God asks this question for Hagar's sake, not for his own sake. You remember in the Garden of Eden, I talked about this in the summer, but God asked Adam and Eve, who were hiding in the trees, where are you? And remember, God asks this question for their benefit, not his. God knew where they were. He wasn't calling out to find them. He knew where they were. He asks the question as to draw them out and draw them to himself. Similarly, in this story, God doesn't ask Hagar where she is and where she's going because he doesn't know. God asks because his character is such that he cares about people's stories, and he cares about those who have no one to tell those stories to. God asks her the question to tell her, I'm listening. And so, with God present in her disregarded story, Hagar answers God. I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she says. Church, don't overlook the significance of what's happening here. This woman is pregnant, exiled, alone, and in between pain and uncertainty. She's been mistreated, she's been overlooked, she's been disregarded, and we can imagine that part of what made her feel so much that way was that her side of the story was repeatedly unheard and seemingly did not matter anymore. But in that lonely, disregarded desert, God makes himself known to her. And before God offers her any instruction, before God takes even leadership of her journey, he reveals to this lady, feeling disregarded by people, that he's listening to her. The one true God has given the disregarded his ear. That's deep. What we see in this small, perhaps easy to overlook detail is that God reveals himself to people by asking us questions in such a way that we come to know he's listening to us. This gentle act of paying attention is such a gentle act of generous grace and mercy and compassion and benevolent care and kindness and love, etc., etc., etc. But what I love is that God is not just a well-meaning buddy. He's not just a pal who listens but remains powerless to offer any type of direction, as we have all felt at times when we have heard horrible, sad stories from people we care about. God is different. He does something to help. So our second point is that when we feel disregarded, and we might say when we know we have been disregarded by others, God speaks order into the chaos of that experience. Verses 9 and 10, the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. I don't have this in my notes, but I just want to say, don't get caught up on the angel language. This is what's called a theophany. It's a technical theological term for when God makes himself visible to people. And so you'll see in the Old Testament that sometimes God is revealed to as the angel of the Lord. But this is God interacting with her. This isn't like Gabriel or Michael or a different angel. This is in fact God, okay? So don't get caught up on, whoa, who's actually talking to her here? This is the angel of the Lord, okay? So in the beginning, as Genesis starts, God is the one whose word ordered the chaos and created life from the darkness, right? And so, of course, then in this moment, it's the word of God that orders the chaos in Hagar's life. The chaos caused by being disregarded by people. And after listening to her story and inviting her to share her pain at the hands of another person, God now starts to speak. And when he speaks, he doesn't speak fluffy sentiment. He doesn't speak Hallmark, there, pat on the back. When God speaks, he immediately bring order to her past, but also order to her future. And so what does he say? He says, first, go back and submit yourself to your mistress. Submit yourself to Sarai. Now, God's instructions here are perhaps surprising to us. The God of rescue sends her back to the one that's disregarding her. He doesn't save her from Sarai. He doesn't remove her from the situation permanently. He sends her back. Now, before I explain why he did this, I need to make a little Cole's note here. I want to say, and this is an important thing for you to understand whenever you're studying the Bible for yourself, when you're looking at narrative stories, you don't want to pull doctrine from narrative necessarily, because doctrine is truth, 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 and sometimes stories contain things that are specific for that individual. So let me be more specific. If we look at what takes place in this story and we go, that's the doctrine, then the prescription for us is that anytime we're in a horrible or abusive or dangerous relationship, that we just go back to it and submit ourselves to that. If we're pulling doctrine from this story, that would be the absolute truth. And we'd go, well, Genesis 16 says you always go back and submit the one who's abusive to you. Well, we would say that would be remarkably dangerous. That might be unwise. That might be unhealthy. We wouldn't necessarily counsel that way. Maybe we would, but that's why we can't just take a black and white truth out of Genesis 16 and say, well, that's what God told Hagar to do, so you better go do that, okay? So we don't take doctrine from narrative. That's dangerous, okay? You got to counsel of Scripture if you're going to make a doctrinal decision on something, okay? The question then, so why did God do it, though? So let's move back to that. Why would God say go back to her? And this is the basic answer. The basic answer is that at the time of this story, with what Hagar was facing as a pregnant female, that it was actually far, far, far better and far safer for her to go back, to submit herself, yes, to Sarai, but then place herself under the covering of Abram, both his practical wealth, practical honor, his practical status, but also even under his blessing that God had placed on his life, that she would get this sort of like blessing runoff by coming under that family's authority over her life. So God looks at her and says, actually, though it seems like that will be worse for you, you will actually have a better future if you go back. Now, we could go, well, God, okay, that seems hard, and so you've called her back, and we get that maybe there'll be some, good things that'll come from that, but that seems like that's going to be hard. So what about all the rest of her days? Where will you be then in all those days after she submits? And that's where God goes on to make a really remarkable promise to her. He reorders the past, says go back, but then he speaks about her future, and he says this creative word, and he promises her uncountable offspring, not so different from what Abram receives. God orders her future by promising a great provision for Hagar. As one disregarded by people, God promises the one alone and in exile, I will surround you with family. I will surround you with people. I will surround you with people. And at the time of this story, to be surrounded by family meant she would be always taken care of. That she would have sons and daughters that would support her and take care of her needs and defend her. All the things she did not have, God says, I'm going to give you that in such abundance that it will be uncountable to you. So yeah, you need to go and submit, and you're going to put yourself under covering, and it's going to reorder your past, but there's going to be future in it. And then in addition, your future is going to be very bright and very full because I'm going to surround you with good people. Now, if you know her story, there's some bumps in the road that still come along. But God absolutely was with her, walking with this disregarded lady, speaking this bright future and reorder past all over her. And what I want to make sure I say to you, because I think that her life deserves this. Hagar, the one so disregarded by others, holds the distinction as the first woman in the Bible to receive a birth annunciation of her future children, but also the first woman in the Bible to receive a promise directly from God's mouth to her. That's what God does for the disregarded. We can't help then but find great hope and confidence in God's character as being revealed in this story. What is God like? What is God like with the disregarded? Well, he listens. He reorders what's painful. He points and he creates a bright future. He cares about us. And when we have been disregarded by someone, I think that we tend to remember and recycle all the feelings of the past, don't we? What they said or what they did or what we should have said or what we should have done in response. And we replay the tapes and we consider it again and we watch the scenes go in our memory. And then there's times also where we take that pain of the past and we go, and look at how it's affecting my future. And look at all these moments of trauma and I'm triggered and it hurts here because that happened then. Now my future's ruined, and yet God comes in and he begins to speak to both her past and her future. He makes sense of her future by reordering her past. God is the one who comes close to the disregarded, and he does more than offer the friendly pat on the back. God speaks order into chaos. Chaos caused by people in our lives. And then that uncertainty that can come, he speaks peace and future and promise and goodness in our days ahead. So from this conversation with God, then Hagar has a noteworthy response to all that's happened. God who hears her, the God who speaks to her, now she begins to respond. And that noteworthy response gives us this truth this morning when we No, God sees us. We know we have seen God. Verses 13 and 14. She gave this name to the Lord, which is really a remarkable thing. It's like when God has poured out life-changing blessing on your life, what do you say of him? What do you call God? We name a lot of things, we designate a lot of things, we place labels on a lot of things, but this little verse, she gave this name to the Lord. Wow. Who spoke to her. And here's the name. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar marks the moment of God's care in the thick of her disregarded isolation by speaking of God as El Roi. And for someone fresh in their feeling of being unseen, the name El Roi, what that means, speaks everything that her heart and her mind received from God in this moment. So El Roi means either the God who sees me, as translated here, or it means the God of seeing. And either way, for a person wandering literally and figuratively unseen by anyone, what an experience, what a deposit of God's mercy into her life to know that she has been seen by God. And appropriately, Hagar marvels. She marvels at this moment in her life. She marvels at the moment where she has come to know that God does in fact see her. And perhaps this truth would mean very little to someone who's always felt seen, regarded by people, and has always had platform and has always had audience. But to someone in the middle of the desert running away from the mistreatment and disregard via human beings, Hagar's revelation that God sees her when no one else does is certainly nothing less than a life-changing truth. But this life-changing truth isn't just one-sided. It's something like a coin. She has the blessing of the God who sees me on one side. But then this blessing gets flipped over, and there's something else on the other side, and she says that God sees me, but also I have seen the Lord, the other side of the experience. When God allowed to feel his gaze upon her, he also let her place her gaze upon him. For a disregarded person, this is a miracle. Hagar came to know that when God saw her, she was seeing God. Now, not literally, of course, but she realized she's in a moment of encounter. She's in a moment of engagement with the holy, true God, and she stands in this moment, and then she says something amazing, and I have lived. I've come out of the other side of it. And this realization, this encounter, oh my goodness, I was looking upon the Lord, even as he was looking upon me, leaves a lasting legacy. So in verse 14, we read that this sight of God's regard for the disregarded becomes a place of honor. The text says that the sight of this encounter becomes known as Bir Lahai Roi, which means, is your translation, the well of the living one who sees me. The well of the living one who sees me. And what I love about this name is that it does not commemorate a one-time event. The God who saw me that day. It commemorates an abiding element of that experience with God all the days of her life. He is the God who sees me, not the God who saw me, but the God who is seeing me, sees me, will see me. God saw Hagar in a moment, but he's the God who sees into her future, will see her in all the moments that lie before her. God sees the whole thing. And her story goes on to prove that God was seeing her. And so from everything this lady experienced at the hands of disregarding people to what God did and what God said, her awe is tremendous. There's great awe in her heart. And I think as a people who have been disregarded by others, often at times, sometimes horribly, it is good to join Hagar in her awe that when no one else saw, God did. To stand with her and marvel that God sees and shows himself to the disregarded people is an incredible character of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And not just for the moment, right? Like not just for that second or that day, as if he passed on his way to somewhere else and happened to notice her, helped her out, like he changed her flat tire on the side of the road and she never learned his name. But that he's the God who goes forward as our seer, the one who sees constantly. Now, as we wrap up, here's sort of some lasting thoughts I want to leave with you. You know, we might read this ancient story so many years later as a people who are living in a completely different culture, a completely different context than Hagar did, and we may feel like this story doesn't have too many connections to our lives. But I hope all of the reasons that Hagar's story is different from yours doesn't cause you to overlook the truth that we also, though, are a people that can at times overlook others. We have overlooked others. We have disregarded others. And we have been overlooked and disregarded by others too. We exist in a world in which we occupy spaces and places of disregard too often. And we place people in spaces and places of disregard too often. And like Hagar, we know what it feels like to be mistreated in others in such a fashion that we have felt that our only option is to get out of Dodge, to run away. And as I said at the beginning of this message, we are a people that are so connected to others, yet so frequently crippled by a feeling that we are unseen. Well, that's a lot of connections. Though Hagar's story took place long ago and far away, the damage of disregard caused by human beings is not something that is foreign to us. We have all known something like Hagar's pain. But we have also known her testimony. In fact, we have an even greater experience and an even greater testimony than Hagar. And maybe today you're thinking, as I've been talking, you've been thinking, well, I sure wish God would. Or I sure wish God would do that for me. That hasn't been my experience with God. Well, I get that, and I have said those things. But I'm so glad I'm wrong. And I gently say, so are you, if that's what you're feeling. God has done more for you than he did even for Hagar in that moment. And here's why, and here's how. Through his son Jesus, God has shown the world, all the people, that it has been seen, that it has been noticed, that it has been regarded. But also through Jesus, God has done something else, the other side of that blessing. He has shown us himself. He's let us see him. We know that while we were sinners, that our way was not hidden from God, and he sent his son to rescue us from the one who holds the power of sin and death. He saw our situation and he responded. But God didn't do it in secret, and he didn't do it in veiled identity. Today we know what God looks like, and we know what acts like. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father, says Jesus. We know his creative, redemptive voice, and we know his truth, which has spoken order into our past, peace into our present, promise into our future. And I think it's the Apostle John who has arguably said this most beautifully. I want to show you, talking about this. John 1:14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. What does he say? We have seen his glory. The glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father. Why did he come from the Father? For the sake of what he saw, which is our broken mess and our sin, full of grace and truth. And then I think he just kicks it up a notch in his epistle. 1 John chapter 1, right at the beginning. That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. The life appeared. We have seen it and testify to it, and we proclaim to you the eternal life which was with the Father and has appeared to us. Do you see the juicy words in there? This is what they teach my kids in school, to find the juicy words. I mean, there is remarkable language. We've seen his glory. We've heard. we've looked at, our hands have touched. We've seen it, we testify, and we proclaim it, and there's life in it. I mean, this is remarkable, poetic, beautiful language of the God who regards the disregarded. You see, it's not then just Hagar who honored God as one who sees and can be seen, and one who orders chaos. It is our encounter. It is our testimony. This we proclaim also. And you remember that place where Hagar encountered God came to be known as the well of living one who sees me? And it became a location remembered for God's intervention. But we also have a location, a place we honor, a place we commemorate as the place that we knew for certain God saw the world and revealed himself to her. And that place is the cross of Christ, a place where God's only Son was disregarded by his own people, disregarded by the religious and the societal elites, disregarded by military power, disregarded by governmental rule, disregarded by the poor, disregarded by the rich. But in that place of disregard, God proved, as Psalm 16 says, and Peter preached on Pentecost Sunday, so to speak, you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead, nor will you let your faithful one see decay. When the world disregarded Jesus, God did not. God did not let him see decay. And through his Son, he let him see life. And now God, through Jesus, has let all the world find life too. You see, we are seen. And we see. Church, you may have known well the place of disregard from people. Just never noticed. And perhaps you know that sting today, even as you sit here and consider all this. And so my pastoral prayer is that you might be encouraged in the space and place that is feeling disregarded by people, because you are still in a place where God is pleased to tell you and to demonstrate to you that you are seen. You've never been overlooked a day in your life, not by him. And my hope and prayer is that this consideration of the God who sees when no one else does would speak a different word to your past, would speak a different moment to your today, a different truth, and it would inform your future. To borrow from Hagar, for we most certainly are a people who have seen God and lived. Amen. So as we come to the table, what do we remember? Well, we remember that God saw us.